So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 18th webinar in the MERLIN Research Project series. We're extremely fortunate to have with us Chris Spray of the University of Dundee, who is currently the Tweed Forum's Eddleston Water Science Manager, formerly Director of the Environmental Science for Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and he's an Emeritus Professor of Water Science and Policy at the UNESCO Center for Water Law, Policy and Science at the University of Dundee. His research and teaching focus on freshwater ecosystems, river restoration and science involved in policy. The presentation today will cover the challenges and results from the Eddleston Water project, which was begun as a scoping study in 2010. It's a long-running empirical study of the effectiveness of using natural flood management measures at a landscape scale to reduce flood risk and enhance riparian ecology. Chris, we are very, very grateful that you could be with us. The format should be roughly 25 to 30 minutes of presentation and then roughly 30 minutes of questions. Please, at any time, put questions in the chat. I will be copying them and keeping a record, and we'll try to keep it quite orderly and of recognizing you all in turn. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon from a very dreich-looking Scotland out the window here. I'll just go straight into this and the Eddleston Water project. Just to start, we refer in Scotland to natural flood management. It's a nature-based solution, and it covers all the measures you might use in different locations within a catchment that could help reduce flood risk. And they also deliver other benefits. So NFM, as we refer to it, is part of a sustainable flood risk management approach. It's not NFM instead of or against traditional flood defences. It's very much working across the whole catchment to restore features, to enhance features, but not forgetting that you will still need to build walls and have good flood protection schemes. And in Scotland, we have a very interesting legal basis to this, which goes back to the 2009 Act, which came out of the EU Floods Directive. And I bear the scars of helping take this through the Parliament at the time. And it actually has a section which requires anyone promoting a flood scheme to assess to what extent the natural characteristics, as it's put in section 20, could help reduce flood risk. But as the parliamentary inquiry at the time recognised, the science evidence base, certainly in 2009, wasn't up to that. And the key areas where they realised they needed better scientific information around what is the effectiveness of the different NFM measures, how could you assess the costs and benefits of using them, including other benefits potentially that you might have that don't just equate to flood damages, and how can you work with land managers to help implement them? So there's behavioural science, environmental economics, and good old-fashioned hydrobiology. And they recommended setting up a pilot study, and the Eddleston is the main pilot study, an empirical one that Scottish Government have funded. The map there, rather small, just gives you an idea where we are. Edinburgh is hidden underneath the green, I'm afraid to say, of the first one.
Chris,
yeah.
We cannot see your second slide yet.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, there it is.
Right. Sorry, I realized what I was doing there. So you will have caught up that lot there, I hope. As I said, in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a map of Scotland. You'll see Edinburgh, and it's hidden underneath the green of the Edinburgh project. These are all projects, natural flood management ones, that Tweed Forum have been involved in, and I'll come back to them in a minute. But there are other projects going on in Scotland, but this is the main one that's focusing purely on natural flood management as opposed to other areas of river restoration. So that's the key area there at the bottom of your green one there. Hopefully you can see that there. Okay, so the main aims of the study are threefold. to assess the effectiveness of NFM measures to reduce flood risk, to assess what they could also do to restore habitats and species, and to work with landowners to do so while maintaining farm businesses. So what the study doesn't have is a huge pot of money to persuade farmers to do things differently that they would not otherwise do within their farm businesses. And that's very important to understand, and we'll come back to that. And it's both empirical and modelled evidence. And why the Eddleston? Well, it's typical. It's nothing particularly special. It's about 69 kilometres squared. It's a river and valley that's been substantially changed. It's got a very long history of flooding. It's very poor for wildlife. Under the EU Water Framework Directive, it was actually rated as bad, which is a great place to start because everything you do can only make things get better. There was local landowner interest. Indeed, one of the landowners themselves at Cringlety began it all by asking Tweed Forum whether they could do something about his rather boring river. And it's got this organisation called Tweed Forum. Tweed Forum is now a 30-year-old participative catchment rivers trust, if you'd like to think of them as such, who've been working in this catchment and the whole of the Tweed, 5,000 square kilometres, all that time. So very well known, and they know the area very well. And there it is, it's very heavily straightened. That river's about 19 kilometres long. And at the bottom in Peebles, it joins the main river Tweed, heading eastwards towards Berwick upon Tweed and into England, actually. So the project began with a scoping study, and perhaps that's one of the really big learning points of all of this, the luxury, but it really ought to be more than the luxury of having a scoping study. And the University of Dundee, who I was working with at the time, won the contract to carry out that study, along with CBEC Eco Engineering in its early existence in the UK. And we had to do four things. We had to characterize the river. We had to propose NFM measures that might be implemented, but we also had to establish a monitoring strategy and develop a stakeholder engagement strategy. So all of that was done. And just to give you an idea of some of the work that CBEC did, on the right, you've got an aerial photograph of the river, and you can see how straight it is at this point. And the scoring colours that Hamish and his team did was to try and show the level of impact, in fact, how affected the river was by past engineering works. And the orange and the red are very, very damaged areas where the channel is embanked, it's got heavy stone alongside it. And then there are other areas where it's slightly less so. And the red and orange sites then become potentially areas where you could do a lot of work for natural flood management. So what we did then was to form a project partnership. All these things always have partnerships. And as I said, this one is managed by Tweed Forum, but it's got on the board also Scottish Government, Scottish Borders Council and SEPA, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. The Borders Council, the local authority, are very important because they are the flood authority within Scotland, not in England, but in Scotland, the 32 regional local authorities are actually the flood authorities. SEPA are the overarching strategic hydrometric area. And then there are two main science providers. There's the University of Dundee and the British Geological Services, who do all the groundwater. We then have an advisory group made up of the normal folk you might expect, the farmers, the landowners, the forest folk, the nature conservation, the fisheries folk, and one or two others. And then critically, the third part of this are the landowners, the managers, the farmers, the foresters, and the local communities as well. And what we did was to aim to work with the character of the landscape to suggest potential locations that could either slow the flow of water, temporarily hold them back, and also improve the habitats. So the sorts of things we're doing is blocking upland ditches, putting in high flow log restrictors, planting lots of trees, digging ponds, re-meandering the channel, and creating new areas. So in terms of characterizing the catchment, and just to give you an idea of what this looks like, this area has been flooded for centuries. There are nice records we've got there of floods all the way through. And in terms of the size, we've got something just under 600 properties at risk downstream in Peebles, and that indeed is downstream in Peebles there, as well as some other sites along the way. So it's a real issue. It's a really important area where flooding has occurred many times before. Amazingly, we actually know what this river used to look like. Across the whole of Scotland, we had maps made in the 1740s by, or not by necessarily, by General Roy, following the last 1745 rebellion. And the British Hanoverians from the south decided they ought to map the area as a military campaign, really. But in doing so, they also produced some very good detailed maps of the countryside. So 1750, top right-hand side, a very sinuous stem, and those woodlands are still actually there. And that aerial photograph earlier on I showed you, that's exactly that area. So we know it was very sinuous in 1750, but we know that it was then channelized by 1810. And amazingly, in the National Museum of Scotland, we discovered the map on the left, which is the map produced by the engineers who were going to build a new road between Peebles and the capital in Edinburgh. And they decided the best way to build this new road was to move the river out of the way. So that is a map of the old river plus a dotted line in pencil, which says line of new cut of river. Unfortunately, we've only got that bit, but that was then done in about 1800. It was then followed by a railway in 1850, and that meant that the whole river banks were strengthened. And for the following 200 years, the river hardly moved at all, with the exception of a little bit of subsequent agricultural drainage. So in terms of hydrology, the main bit is to set up a very comprehensive monitoring network. And we have probably the densest hydrometric network in the United Kingdom of its size. There will be much more dense ones for 5 or 10 square kilometers. But we have a very dense hydrometric network with river gauges all the way down the system. And we can easily track, as that left-hand graph shows, individual storms coming down the catchment, and as they hit each of the sub-catchments, and there are in fact now a lot more gauges along this. We have a gauge roughly every 2 kilometers of the river split through the whole area and its tributaries. And the hydrology is really interested in trying to look at what happens to flood peaks. So you've got a graph in that top left-hand corner with the discharge, a rainfall event in blue, and then a lag time between the rain and the floods and the peak flow. And what we're interested in doing is trying to increase that lag time, lower the peak flow, and basically take the risk out of flooding downstream in Peebles at the March Street south end of that catchment. So the hydrology is absolutely vital. It underpins absolutely everything. And that's run by my colleague, Andrew Black at the University of Dundee. We also have a very comprehensive groundwater monitoring network. I'm not really going to say any more about this, but the British Geological Survey, BGS, have installed a series of groundwater measuring devices at different depths all the way through one particular area. It's not the whole way through the catchment, it's one area. And if you want to learn more about that, I advise you to go to the BGS website, and there's a very good geological model of Darn Hall. And what they're interested in is trying to work out the relationship between what's happening within the soil and the upper geology with what you can see going on in terms of the flooding above. In terms of the ecology and the river morphology, there we took a different approach. We actually tried to produce some before-after control impact designs, and we were really interested in one particular type of action, one particular NFM, and that is remeandering the channel. And the reason we chose that is because it's one of the most used methods for river restoration in Scotland, and always assumed to be very good in terms of flood management as well. So we actually have 2 remeander sites, the 2 in red, 2 controls, one at the top of the catchment, one at the bottom. And we've done work here on the ecology, macroinvertebrate sampling, certain amount of fish sampling, and a lot of intense sediment channel sampling using high-tech pieces of equipment like metal waste buckets cut off and dug into the ground. You know, we know how to do things like this. The key thing is that we had a couple of years before we remeandered, and we've now had 10 years afterwards, so we can look at the trajectory of recovery of the river to this big perturbation of taking a channel and trying to remeander it. And we've done the ecological and the sediment channel sampling at the same locations. And amazingly, all the aquatic invertebrate monitoring has been done by the same individual, Lorraine Quinn from SEPA, bottom right-hand corner. So we've removed one very common form of uncertainty and variability. And the scoping study then identified the potential options to reduce flood risk. And we did a map like this, which is the catchment, with all sorts of potential options. No discussion with land managers, no discussion with the owners. This was the theory of what might be worth doing in these areas. And interestingly, we're doing that again right now, but this time with a very, very detailed model, LiDAR, catchment hydraulic one. So in a totally different layer of capability to have the same ideas. But this is what we did way back in 2010 and came up with the ideas of the sorts of things we might do. There's one very obvious missing natural flood management, and that is nowhere in all of this have we attempted to alter the farming practice, the soil, the stocking density, the regenerative areas. That's something that in our early discussions with farmers, we were told they would not be keen to take forward. It's something that now we're having a rethink of trying to do and how we might try and do it. If you think of the potential storage of water that can actually happen in soil in a catchment like this. The key next bit was to take that list and negotiate with farmers. And this was one of the key roles of Tweed Forum. So the list has come from the policymakers and the researchers, and the Tweed Forum personnel then go out onto the farms and talk to the land managers. And the reason they do that rather than the academics or anyone else is that they know the farms, they understand farm businesses. So for instance, the current person doing this main role, Hamish, his grandfather used to own and farm one of the farms in the valley. So there's a lot of knowledge, but most important, they understand the farm businesses. And what they do then is negotiate and agree on the grounds what might happen. And then Tweed Forum arrange for it to happen. So Tweed Forum will do all the contracts, fill in all the paperwork. There are no legal agreements in all of this. This is done with a shake of a hand, numerous cups of coffee, possibly the odd whiskey, and trust. And the big trust is that we'll come back if things go wrong. So this is what we've managed to produce so far. 116 high flow log restrictors, about 330,000 native trees on about 210 hectares, and 3.5 kilometers of new meanders. And in addition, 38 new ponds scattered throughout the catchment. And as I said, one of the things about this is that this is negotiated. So here's a very good example. This is 3 different landowners. The dotted line is the old course. And in terms of negotiating with landowners, what might happen, the landowner at Lakewood was very happy, massive re-meanders in there, fallen trees, the meanders can wander anywhere. We dug him a pond, but he didn't want the field immediately in the middle, the bright green one, to ever flood, because it was very important to his farming business. It has silage cuts twice a year. He was happy with the field further down. The guy on the left at Milkiston was very difficult to deal with in terms of trying to get him to agree to things. We did his last, so we did the Cringlety one first, Lakewood second, and Milkiston last. That meander doesn't move at all. If it did, it would take that road out, which would be fairly disastrous, and also some telegraph wires. And the guy at Cringlety, right at the top, who in fact was the landowner who said, could you come and do something with my very boring river? He didn't actually want too much done. He didn't want a very sinuous river, and he wasn't that keen on trees, interestingly. So you've got 3 different negotiations, 3 different times to try and get to where we actually did. And that's just the Lakewood one again from a different angle, showing just how much we increased the river there, 46% increase in channel length, 4 new ponds left, 1.8 hectares of native woodland, and the floodplain reconnected in some areas, but not everywhere at all, because the riverbanks still survived in others. And in terms of the other ones, this is what a log structure looks like. 116 of those up on the middle burn. The key thing about them is that the water flows underneath all the time. So it's not like a beaver dam. It has a flow underneath, so salmon could come in underneath it should they wish to. And it's very cheap and very cheerful. These were felled from the area just next to it, and we're in the process now of working with Forest and Land Scotland to up these tremendously to make them far bigger and better than they are now. They really were cheap and cheerful, but remarkably effective for what we did. And in terms of planting, as you might imagine, a lot of riparian planting, a lot of native trees, and focusing in on the river valleys themselves and then some of the top areas. And the ponds, we put in 38 leaky ponds. Most of them are right up in the headwaters, and they're designed to temporarily store water. So you have an inlet and an outlet pipe system. We're giving at least 50% available capacity prior to an event occurring. And the inflow and the outflow designs probably still need modifying. This is very much learning by doing for different sizes and shapes of ponds. And again, everyone has to be negotiated with a landowner so that they'll actually be happy with what we're doing. And some of them want duck shooting, some of them want biodiversity, some of them are just happy to see whatever comes. So what we learned so far, maybe I'll deal with this in 4 different ways. The effectiveness, the impact on habitats, the costs, and then generally about how you can work with people to get this to happen. And in terms of the first one, do these measures reduce flood risk? Well, the answer is yes, but it's largely a small scale reduction. So what we've been able to show is the lag time, that's the time between a rainfall event arriving and a peak flow, can be reduced significantly in the headwater sites by using these flow restrictors. So up in the middle burn, the Shiplaw burn in the top northwest corner, we were able to do a nice Backy experiment showing that big increase in lag, and that occurs highly significant still at 25 square kilometers. You can still see it at the 36 square kilometer stage. By the time you're down at 69 square kilometers, any impact has disappeared. So that's a very good, effective work, and that's been published by Andrew Black and colleagues in Journal of Flood Risk Management. The other thing we've seen so far is that the 2-year return period flood peak has reduced dramatically post measures in the upper catchment and much less so in the lower catchment. So we're showing the impact of these high flow structures and associated in the headwater streams. In terms of remeandering, this is a far less impactful event. Yes, there is a certain amount of increase in floodplain storage, particularly if you can take flood banks down, obviously. And this is just the main area around Cringleton and Lakewood, and a diagram that's come from monitoring and modelling work from Barry Hankin and colleagues using HECRAS 2D in particular, to look at improved extra storage from the meanders that we've been able to put in. Where you've got that, you've got an increase of up to 6%, but work by Isabel Costaz, as a PhD student, showing that actually if you just meander and you don't take down the riverbanks and open up the floodplain, you get very minimal extra storage or impact at all, even with these increased lengths. And it may just not even get to about 2% in terms of what you've got. In terms of ponds, we've created all these, but the pond storage volume is generally small compared to the catchment area and the associated runoff. So what that's showing is that we actually can get really quick wins, but the impact is really in relative to the size of the subcatchment. We also realize that while ponds are designed to always hold some water, the freeboard is negotiable, and we'd probably need more freeboard. Hydrologists like ponds to be empty, ecologists like them to be full. There's always a balance. And the current design also at the moment doesn't empty fast enough. So these start failing when you get a run of floods and a run of events one after another. But the key message is, yes, they work, but it's all about the size and the number of ponds in relation to the size of the catchment. If you create a big floodplain storage pond, they can be way more effective. We've only created one down the bottom end. And again, we've got both empirical and model data here, showing that since we did this, and this is just above Peebles, we've seen a reduction of about 21% in the peak flood flow further downstream. And we've also worked out how much extra that stores compared to the floodplain itself. And we know from modeling that you could get, if you did get 5 such ponds in series, we could locally reduce discharge peaks by almost 20%. But the huge but is that floodplains occupy some of the best farmland, and therefore they're not the sort of thing that farmers are willing to negotiate or agree. That particular one was because, again, a very, very friendly hobby farmer who was very willing to see us what's there. In terms of woodland planting, clearly planting is going to take a lot of time before it has a really good impact on flood flows. We've modelled some work with Ruth Dietrich at Edinburgh University early on, showing in theory you could get 20% reduction in peak flood flows, but that's by putting in masses, landscape scale tree planting, and obviously you start losing out in agricultural production. More impressively, perhaps, the BGS work with Dundee University showing that the infiltration underneath mature broadleaf woodland is between 5 and 8 times higher than the adjacent grazed pasture. You can see in that bottom right-hand corner what happens on a grazed pasture. The water runs very fast off. In terms of the wildlife, does the remeandering improve habitats? Well, yes. First one, obviously, is it just adds a lot more habitat. If you've got 46% more channel length, you've got a lot more habitat for salmon, for lampreys, for otters, for macroinvertebrates. We've also got a very obvious increase in physical diversity. This is just the data from Lakewood in 2009 before we meandered, and 2016 afterwards, and using the 5 very commonly defined habitat types, you can see we've got a lot of increase with deep pools, very important for climate change, lower temperatures, and increase in riffles, as opposed to a rather more normal and boring pre-restoration picture. You can take a lot more data in there and show that actually the important area here is the extent of active bar features in the channel, and you get rapid recolonization by invertebrates and fish on that. A lot of this data is still very much being analysed, and indeed the latest set of data is only just being collected, assuming the river has gone down far enough. The fish picture is less clear. I think that's the nicest way of putting it. I'll happily comment on that later. But the other interesting thing is we've done some work on the flood storage ponds. 2 Swiss students, a master's student, and then this year a PhD student. And that's really showing that the macroinvertebrate communities and the ponds are very good. They are every bit as good as, at the family level, similar conservation ponds around in the UK. Despite the fact they were built and designed for flood storage, and particularly again for odonata for dragonflies, we're getting some very good results there. So that basically shows that the flood storage ponds can play that dual role, both alleviating flooding and enhancing catchment. And then just coming closer to the end, is this decent value for money? If you talk to politicians, this is the one things they wish to know straight away. We've done some work on environmental economics using standard methodologies, so we haven't invented anything new specifically. We've used HM Treasury's Green Book. And the first thing to show is that the flood measures give us a net present value of about £950,000, so that's about €1 million in terms of flood damages avoided downstream. And that's what we'd done by 2021. We hypothetically increased that to what we thought might be the maximum and got close to about 3 million. But the really interesting thing about that is the added measures, the added benefits you get from natural flood management dwarf those. So again, using best practice methods, a method called BEST actually in this case, the total value of other benefits delivered by these same measures is 4 times as much. It's about 4.2 million. So the take-home measure there is that the total value of other benefits delivered by NFM are 4 times higher than the flood damages avoided alone. Whereas, of course, if you're building a flood wall, that's the only benefit you get. So then to capture and just end on the sort of lessons, I think what we'd say is that the different measures can reduce flood risk, but appreciable flood risk reduction is only ever going to occur when you've got widespread application of many types of approach, and that the whole NFM approach works best at small spatial scales and at low levels of flood risk. A 1 in 50-year flood will go straight through the system, whatever we do. But NFM measures can also deliver very important biodiversity gains, and that these gains, the additional benefits, can actually be very, very high. And we've actually also got some fantastic new ones in terms of walking and cycling and access, and we've been able to demonstrate that. And in terms of implications for delivery, and this is where we also touch on how we work with farmers, what we clearly need is an integrated policy approach at the catchment scale, because you can't think of NFM alone. It's got to be part of that sustainable flood risk management. So you also have the flood walls. It's got to be part of climate change adaptation and restoring biodiversity. And what we've done is to voluntarily negotiate designs. And the key thing here was the use of a trusted intermediary, Tweed Forum. So it wasn't the Environment Agency walking onto the farm. It wasn't a consultant. It wasn't an academic. It wasn't someone from authority. It was a trusted local organization that has no money and has no designs or regulatory powers over the people they're talking with. That's a very different conversation. But if we actually want to take this forward, voluntary uptake is not optimal. We actually had better and more effective designs left on the shelf. There are areas where we designed some really interesting novel remeandering and flood storage, but it didn't fit with the business plan of the farmers concerned. So what we need to do is to shift that land management support so that farmers will get sustained payments to actually encourage them to see this as a long-term land use rather than just a negotiated one alongside their own farming. And we actually have a current piece of work. We've got about €250,000 to work to create a new green finance mechanism where we're going to try and attract private finance and investors to pay a living wage, if you like, but to pay something maybe in the region of £300-400 a hectare ongoing as a revenue for up to, say, 10-20 years to farmers to do things differently. So that's a real next step that will need to happen. We still need, obviously, better project scheme appraisal that needs to recognize this full value of the land use benefits. And we need the land use planning to actually target joined up catchment approaches. It's no good having one farmer here, 2 farmers there, and not having a joined up catchment approach from the headwaters all the way through. And we always need better evidence to underpin this, to persuade farmers that that's actually what is worth doing. It's interesting that when we talk to the farmers, and we regularly do have community events just for farmers, just for the community, no one else there, they're always very interested in the evidence base and seeing what's happened and seeing where their next door neighbours have done it. So on that, I will end, Jan, and say a thank you to a crowd of hundreds who've been involved in this over the time. A lot of this data is available very easily on the website, which is at the bottom, and happy to share. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very clear and very well illustrated presentation. We already have several questions. Okay. The first question is from Alejandro Dusayan. Did you get enough extreme flows before interventions in 2010 to 2013 and a range of small and medium and large floods?
That's a very good question. And the answer is, by luck, yes. We had 2 years pre, and the second year, 2012, is still the heaviest, largest floods we've seen on the system. December 2022 was very close to it, but didn't quite make it. So we've certainly had one very high before. And since then, we've had a whole series, you're quite right. So we're quite happy with the post event. I think we would always have liked more beforehand. But as I say, we did have one very major flood, which was, I'd have to say luck, but we'll take it.
The second question is from Clara Kirpley. Does the Eddleston have tributaries? Did you work on them as well?
Yeah, the main Eddleston has a series of small tributaries, and they were very useful to us in terms of comparing the behavior, if you like, of different subcatchments. And one of the other pieces of work done with BGS is looking at British Geological Survey, is looking at the importance of subsurface geology in terms of the speed of runoff that comes. So the more impermeable the soil is, the faster the runoff comes anyhow. So we've been using that in particular in some research at the moment that's just being written up to look at how you might then think about changing land use, because in some areas it's going to have a bigger effect because of the nature of the subsoil. And we can play around using the subcatchments. The number of gauges is such that we can add and subtract the different subcatchments, if you can see what I mean, to see what happens in one subcatchment with one type of geology and one subcatchment with a different one. So yes, the subcatchments are also gauged.
As a moderator, I'm going to take a little liberty here and follow on that question with one of my own.
Yeah.
Since you said that because it was voluntary, your designs were constrained, everything you did was pretty much down in the floodplain. And I was wondering if you considered at any point things like the work done by Paul Quinn and Mark Wilkinson of leaky fences high on the hills to hold the water at the top of a hill before it comes down. Is that in consideration anywhere?
Yeah, we've had both Paul and Mark on site talking to us. Yeah. The log jams, as we call them, those are actually up in the tributaries. They are fairly high up. I ought to explain that. Sorry, that's my fault. But you're quite right. That is one of the areas we'd like to look at even more so. We're talking with Forest and Land Scotland, who are the public body owning the forest on the northwest side. And we've identified a couple of areas there where we think we can actually hold water up even more. What to us is really quite surprising is that those high flow restrictor log jams, which really are very cheap and cheerful, have such an impact. The stream there is only maybe 1 meter, 2 meters wide, and yet that is still showing 36 square kilometers downstream. So I think you're absolutely right. That is where we would like to put a lot more of our effort.
Great. The next question is from Alejandro Dusayan. Again, there's a series of 4 questions from him. Was reconnecting river groundwater system also relevant for slowing the flow or not much?
That's a very good question. What we seem to have seen, and again, it's not my area of expertise, but it's certainly available in reports on the website, is that the river junction, if you like, between the floodplain and the sides of the valley is absolutely key. And at certain times of year, the groundwater is actually feeding into the river valley. And the other times of the year, the river is feeding back into the groundwater. So it's not a simple system. And it's one of these great challenges one has, that most of the measures and most of the studies look just at what you can see on the surface. And here we're getting more information. And I think as we go forward, we're changing our view slightly as to the absolute importance of understanding, particularly the upper soil area, the soil geology, as to how impermeable that is, and therefore how effective some of the measures may be in highly impermeable as opposed to permeable catchment areas. So our bottomland, our floodplain, is a 8,000-year-old ice-dammed lake, which is why it's so flat, and it's an absolute mix of gravel, silt, sand, alluvium, clay, and then the hillsides are rather different, and they're different east and west. So we do get some different patterns, but certainly the floodplain area, we're seeing water going into and out of the groundwater really quite a lot. So we're very interested in seeing how that actually works. And the model I referred to that BGS have tries to actually articulate that relationship. But essentially at certain areas, at certain times of year, it will feed into the groundwater, and other times of year, particularly on that junction point between the hillside and the floodplain, we'll get it coming out of the groundwater and feeding into the floodplain.
Second question from Alejandro Dusayon. Any trade-offs during low flows? I understand the Tweed River suffers from seasonal spring drought that affects the farmers.
That's a very good question. Again, we haven't looked at droughts as such, but it's certainly worth looking at and thinking about. The ponds in particular will have a great ability to hold water up. So that may well be one of the areas. And similarly, if we can reconnect with the floodplain, and if we can meander more, that will also help hold water from that area. We've not had a major drought in our particular catchment, but you're quite right, it's becoming more and more of a challenge going forward.
Yeah, actually, I was just on the Rio Negro in Brazil, which is down 10 meters.
Wow.
And the work I did on the Tisza in Hungary, the balance between giving security for droughts as well as flood was already very apparent there where they do have droughts. So that's an increasing concern in Scotland, is it?
One of the things that's coming up, in fact, there's a meeting tomorrow, is that the UK Natural Environment Research Council are investing well over 40 million euros into a new flood drought research infrastructure. And one of the 3 sites they're going to tool up across the whole United Kingdom is the Upper Tweed. It's in fact the Tweed just upstream from Peebles. And we're going to be linking into that. They're not actually doing the Eddleston, they're doing the rest of it. So that's going to be a major digital infrastructure looking particularly at droughts and floods together.
All right, the next question is, water seems turbid in some of the pictures. What about sediment storage and floodplain pond storage capacity over time?
That's a good point again. Water quality has never been a major issue in the Eddleston Water. Unlike a lot of particularly UK English catchments where water quality runoff from farms, nutrient enrichment is a major impact. That's actually never been a major problem for us. So although there may well be, you're quite right, 1 or 2 pictures of it looks quite turbid, it's not a big challenge. Sediment supply, I think, is a really interesting one, which we haven't really touched on. And we're guilty perhaps of looking at floods as being movement of water as opposed to also being movement of sediment. And one of the things we're quite interested in terms of the trajectory of recovery is that particularly the downstream meander, which is not a very sinuous meander, has taken a long time before it actually started to look rather different, and we got different differentiation between pools, gravel areas and everything else. And we think that may well be due to just a lack of sediment supply coming down the system to actually enable it to happen. It's not a major flood river. This is, the meanders on the whole stay roughly where we put them, as opposed to moving dramatically. So I think sediment and energy would be a good area of study. I fully agree.
And the final question from Alejandro is, any issues or evidence about tributaries synchronized floods due to measures?
No, it's something certainly we're aware of from other studies. We've looked at what happens with the main Tweed, and we're not having any synchronous problems with that where it comes into Peebles. Peebles is a town at risk of flooding. As I said, there's a flood scheme being developed there, but it'll take a long time before it's actually ever going to get financed in the way that Scottish Government put their priorities for financing. So we've had a look at it, and so have others. And at the moment, the work we're doing here isn't impacting. But certainly, if we go to do more work in the tributaries, as one of the other people was talking about, and you yourself, that's something we shall have to look at in terms of the model and in terms of the potential for actually accidentally suddenly coinciding flood peaks if they're all delayed different areas and suddenly come downstream. But yes, we're aware of that. And it's one of the things we can actually model. I haven't really talked about it, but we got JBA to build a combined hydrological model, which BGS have now improved on with dynamic top model at the top of it, feeding in a lot more data. And that's going to give us the ability to analyze it at even greater depth and discrimination, these particular challenges. Absolutely.
The next question is from Dominic Ashmole. He said, as a local in the context of Scottish level strategy, I'd be keen to see beavers on this stretch of river. What's your view of how their arrival might interact with your project? I'm aware of beavers in enclosures have been deliberately deployed for NFM by one English water company.
Hi Dominic. I'm a great fan of beavers. My only challenge with beavers is that beavers will choose where and what to do in the place that actually suits them. And that may not necessarily fit with the economics and the environment elsewhere once they start moving from where they are. So if you look at the log jams, the high flow restrictors we've put at the top end of the catchment, they actually have very little impact in terms of improving biodiversity or sediment control. All they do is slow water down in high flows and spill that over the catchment. A beaver dam has the huge advantage of also creating habitats, and there's lots of lovely data from, in particular, the Exeter University studies down south on the importance and the impact that has on sediment control, on water quality, on biodiversity, absolutely everything like that. So my only problem with beavers is that they will do that where it suits them best of all, and that may not fit with the farming and other, including transport layouts that we currently have in the site. I know there's plans to develop for beavers elsewhere in the borders, and beavers will get here fairly fast anyhow. They're already in the West Lothian, having got there under their own steam, I suspect. So yeah, beavers are a really important ecosystem engineer.
The next question is from Steve Rose. What technique or techniques did you use to generate a good quality stage discharge relationship at each water level recorder location?
Hi, Steve. An awful lot of work by Andrew Black and his colleagues is the short answer, in appalling weather conditions. So every single one of those gauging stations, Andrew and Finlay and a number of other people go out and measure using an ADCP or whatever else the flows under appalling conditions and under slow flows and low flows. We then have the whole of that independently audited every year by Wallingford Hydro Solutions. So that quality control is a really important thing for this whole data collection scenario. So as I say, all the flood stuff gets quality controlled independently by Wallingford Hydro Solutions, and that's one of the areas they focus in on, not surprisingly, of course. The aquatic macroinvertebrates are independently checked through SEPA and their quality control systems for identification and stuff like that. So we do go out of the way to try and ensure that we have decent quality data, because absolutely that's key.
A question again from Clara Kirkley. Did I get it well that the NFM system is not quite effective in case of larger floods, i.e. a flood 1 in 50-year probability? What is the approach toward those ones in the catchment?
That's a very good question. I mean, it's I think generally recognised, certainly in the UK, that NFM works best for low-level risk floods. So the 1 in 10s, the 1 in 20s year floods, and in small catchments where you can control what's happening. The bigger the catchment, the larger the noise, if you like, all the other things that are happening thereabouts. Which is why NFM always has to be seen in combination with a number of other things. One is building flood walls. Another is do not build in the floodplain. I'll remove the vernacular, but as some of our farmers have said, which bits of flood and plain do people who live downstream not recognise? So not building in floodplains would help. Having good flood forecasting systems will help as well. So it is every one of those. But what's really interesting in Scotland is that we're beginning to see a debate around how big a flood wall should be. So we've got some sites in the borders, but also elsewhere across Scotland, where to reach a 1 in 200 year flood defence level, which is the standard we have at the moment, recognizing shifting baselines, of course, you might hypothetically want to build a 4-meter high wall, and that's just not going to be acceptable to local communities. So you might therefore say, let's build it at 2 meters high, which might well be acceptable, and do a whole load more upstream in terms of infiltration works, a lot of tree planting, remeandering, sediment traps, all the sorts of things we've been doing, flood storage areas. So that's a really live debate as to what level we can achieve going downstream. And I think that plays to exactly that. The 1 in 100 year flood will take out almost anything. And one of the things we've seen in Scotland is over the last decades is that we're seeing an increase in high intensity, very localized events. So one of those pictures I showed at the beginning was a bridge that was taken out at the top of the catchment. It was in a very high intense storm, and it was big enough to take a bridge out that had been there for 100 years. Downstream, and we're only talking, remember, 18 kilometers in Peebles, that hardly altered the hydrograph at all. It's so localized. So, a flood defense scheme can only do what it can do under design. And the more we get these high intense localized rain events, it's going to be really difficult. It's also interesting how important snow melt is in all of this. It seems to be really quite key in terms of increasing the risk. So the 1 in 50 years, a lot of what we have may well get drowned out. You can imagine all those ponds will rapidly get filled. The flood storage areas will get filled. They'll still be working. And in particular, the trees and that mass of vegetation, something what beavers are really good at doing as well, that will be increasing roughness and that will be slowing flow down. So they are important, but that's why I think the general feeling is that this isn't going to stop the 1 in 50s or things like that or higher.
Since I see no other questions, I'll toss in something from the side, and that is we have both in Serbia and in Hungary where they use floodplain forests to raise wild boar. So in other words, when we also in Hungary, the idea is that you can have winter pastures with the Hungarian grey cattle, which are so hardy they never have to come inside during the winter. So I was exploring alternative kind of agriculture that you can have even if the river floods. I don't know if that comes in conversation at all in Scotland.
Well, I don't think it does. We haven't yet got that many wild boar. We've obviously got beavers rapidly establishing themselves, but the idea that the catchments need to be managed is still very much there. I mean, I was in Holland at Nijmegen recently with Stamford and with guys on the EU Resi River project, and there you've got the state buying land and pulling back the flood banks and then turning that over to nature. It's absolutely fantastic. That's not anything we've done so far. But if one was to take forward, my ideas, as I said earlier on, about trying to provide farmers with the correct payments so that they can farm, if you like, flood risk management as a public service alongside food and recreation, that's the way to go. It's not about sort of negotiating with farmers to individually do things. It must be a much more integrated approach to all these policy areas working together at scale.
Well, miraculously, this is supposedly the time we're supposed to end. So we're gliding into the finish line here. And thanks again for an excellent presentation, very clear responses and answers. I would like to point out that someone did ask if this will be available online, and the link was posted in the chat. If you forget that at any time, please contact us at MERLIN and we will give you the link again. We should have the next webinar will be in early February, date to be announced. It's a dangerous time in that this is ski season in Central Europe, but it will be run. So thank you again. Thanks for everyone for coming. And we hope you all have a very lovely holiday season with family and friends. And we look forward to seeing you in February.
Jan, if anyone's there and is coming across to Scotland, get in touch. We'll be very happy to show you around. We always learn by listening to folk coming.
Would love it. Would absolutely love it. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.